Hi there, everyone. I'm back again. Okay, well, I'm not taking over lecture material, and we're not reinstating the tutorials. They're still canceled. But I thought we might take the opportunity to come back and give you the occasional supplementary tutorial material when, we think it might help the course to have a little bit of extra material. Uh, sometimes it'll be stuff that will help to clarify the content of the lectures, and sometimes it'll just be stuff that I think is kind of cool, enrichment material. So I can't promise I'll do this regularly, but anyway, let's jump into the first supplementary tutorial. And today I'm going to try to go a little bit into graph algorithms and their applications. I want to focus, since we focus in the lectures on the graph algorithms, I want to focus in the tutorial on applications of the graph algorithms and examples of problems that you might solve using graph algorithms. Okay, so how do we formulate a problem as a graph problem? Well, you need to define some nodes, and then you need to define some edges, and then hopefully you should be able to kind of plug and chug, take your graph and plug it into, one or more known graph algorithms that people have studied really carefully, and have a really efficient solution to your problem. So the first type of graph algorithm I want to talk about today is breadth-first search. And you guys have probably seen breadth-first search in a few different contexts in a couple different courses. I want to talk about some applications, some problems that you can actually solve using breadth-first search. And the first one of my personal favorites, is pathfinding. If you're trying to implement a game AI, and you can do pathfinding in, for example, a grid graph like this strange Pac-Man-like game. So here we have Pac-Man navigating a 2D maze, and we want to ask, how could we implement pathfinding in this kind of maze? Suppose we want Pac-Man to be able to work his way from the entrance to the exit, and we want him to find the shortest path from the entrance to the exit. And shortest here means the smallest number of cells in the grid traversed. We're not thinking about cells that are faster or slower than other cells to traverse. No special mud or glue cells that slow you down. If you had complicated cells like that, you would have to, if this wasn't basically something that you could express as an unweighted graph, then you would have to use a more sophisticated algorithm than BFS. But for this kind of algorithm, we can just use BFS. So the first thing we have to do is take this problem, which of course is not a graph, and turn it into a graph. So my claim is that you can turn a problem that looks like this into a grid graph, and then you can plug it into BFS and solve the problem. So how do we represent a grid graph? Well, let's zoom in on a small part of this graph, of this board. Let me switch to a laser pointer here. So here in this bottom right corner, I've zoomed in. And one way of doing this is we could treat this simply as, let's just say, like a 3x3 grid. And we could treat, so this would be 9 nodes, and we could treat the presence of a wall as the absence of an edge between two adjacent walls. And then we could treat, of course, the absence of a wall as the presence of an edge between two adjacent cells. Okay, so that's one way we could do this. So here we have now a node and edge-based representation of this grid, and we can run a BFS from the starting cell where Pac-Man starts, so this cell. And that BFS, it's going to explore as many nodes of the graph as it can in ever-increasing distances from the source. And if it ends up visiting the exit node, then it's possible for Pac-Man to exit the graph. And assuming that we implement breadth-first search in a reasonably intelligent way, where every time we explore a new node in the graph, or a new vertex in the graph, we record in a predecessor array the source node that we came from, so we can trace our way backwards from the exit to the source. We can easily come up with the optimal path, or if there are multiple optimal paths, an optimal path through this graph by doing a BFS, seeing if the exit has been visited, and if it has, working your way backwards in the predecessor array to the source. So I want to show you what that looks like. And here I have an animation which was made by somebody else. I, of course, shamelessly stole this from Wikipedia. The previous animation was also made by someone else. I just found it on Google Images. So here is an animation of breadth-first search being run on another grid graph. So again, here it's represented visually as a grid, but of course we can think of each cell as being a node, and of the ability to travel from cell to cell being represented as an edge, and a wall blocking you from traveling to a neighboring cell, representing the absence of an edge between vertices in the graph. So here we're running a BFS starting from this starting node, and you can see the expanding wavefront that's characteristic of BFS. And when I pause here, you can see that it sort of looks like the wavefront contains these three nodes and also these three nodes above. I hope I have a cursor here. Let me go back to my laser pointer. So it looks like you have these three nodes in the wavefront and these four nodes in the wavefront. That's just an artifact of the animation, right? Because it's animating between unhighlighting those cells and highlighting the next cells. So, don't misinterpret this animation. There's a solid expanding wavefront, right at the edge of what's been visited, right? And everything in the wavefront is either at the same distance d from the start, or some of them might be at d+1 already. But we can see this expanding wavefront, and it's going to expand until finally it encounters the destination node. And once we encounter the destination node, we can follow the predecessor pointers to get an optimal path all the way back to the source. And then, of course, if you want to travel from the source to the destination, you can then just follow that path that you traced backwards to the source. Okay, now you might have multiple optimal paths in such a graph, okay? And BFS will arbitrarily return one of them. And if you want to figure out which, if you want to reason about which of the optimal paths is being returned by a BFS, you can just make a small observation that which optimal solution you get will be determined by the order in which you consider adjacent nodes. Okay, so whenever you're at a node and you're adding its neighbors to the queue in BFS, the order in which you add its neighbors to the queue will determine which of the possible optimal solutions you get. Not that that's particularly important, but I thought it was sort of worth mentioning at least. So we can also do game AI pathfinding not just in a grid graph, but in a more sophisticated game world. For example, the world of a 2D platformer shown here. So if you want the enemies to be able to make their way up to the player character in a complex platforming environment, you're going to need something more sophisticated perhaps than slicing this up into a grid graph. And so what you do is you essentially divide the game world into linear paths, and at the endpoints of each of these linear paths, you create waypoints, which are vertices in sort of an overlay graph. And you can do pathfinding using BFS, for example, to find the optimal path through these waypoints. And then as non-player characters travel between waypoints, we simply play an animation that's appropriate to the direction they're moving, left or right, jumping for up, falling for down, and you tween their animation, or you interpolate their positions as you're animating between the waypoints. And if you want these characters to appear to react intelligently to movements of the player in real time, as the player moves, as the player moves and non-player characters are making their way to a waypoint, you could, for example, recompute the optimal path to the player every time a non-player character reaches a new waypoint. So every time a non-player character reaches the waypoint it was moving to, it's going to reconsider its current trajectory and seek out the optimal path towards the player. And by the way, if you wanted, for example, to simulate a scenario where the non-player characters don't have full information about the system, for example, maybe there's some line of sight that's blocking the non-player character from seeing the player, so you don't want the non-player character to be able to chase down the player if they can't see where the player is, then you could simulate this by modifying the waypoint graph. So any waypoints that are not currently visible by the non-player character could, for example, be eliminated from the graph before you invoke BFS, or marked so that they're not visited by the BFS. So this is the rough idea. You divide the world into linear paths, send game characters in straight lines between waypoints, use BFS to find the shortest sequence of waypoints. So we're finding the shortest number of hops, the fewest number of waypoints traversed. Of course, if you have some linear paths that are much slower than others, like, mud, tar, glue, I don't know, really heavy gravity that slows you down, makes it harder for you to jump, and so makes it take longer to jump up, between 2 points, or ropes that you have to climb really slowly. Well, then you're really talking about a waypoint graph where the edges are no longer going to represent unit weights. And in fact, this is true even if you don't have strange surfaces, because the distance between these two waypoints is greater than the distance between these two waypoints, or the distance between these two waypoints. And so you might want to represent these waypoints that are further apart by some larger weight than these waypoints that are closer together. You might want the distance to be their weight, or the distance times some hardness multiplier of what you're moving on to represent the weight. And in that case, you would want to do a weighted single source shortest path. You'd want to use a weighted single source shortest path algorithm, whereas BFS is an unweighted single source shortest path algorithm. So you'd want to use something like Dijkstra or Bellman-Ford, which you'll see, if you haven't already, you'll see a little bit later in the course. So besides game AI, we can also use BFS to solve some user interface problems. So for example, sometimes you want to be able to drag, this is called rubber banding, or you want to drag sort of a flexible curve between obstacles in a user interface. You'd like to be able to, select some subset of the obstacles or partition the obstacles with a flexible line by drawing the shortest path between 2 points. So here, every time the mouse cursor moves, there's a mouse event which is triggering some sort of recalculation and the shortest path between the top left corner and the current mouse location to be rendered on this grid. And so you can clearly do this by, every time you receive a mouse event, recomputing a BFS and tracing the optimal path backwards from the current mouse location to the start, and then updating the grid that's shown on the screen. So you can do all of that every time you receive a mouse event where the mouse is moving. You can actually make this a little bit more efficient by realizing that you only need to recompute if the mouse changes cells. So movement within the same cell shouldn't trigger a recomputation. And second, you don't actually need to rerun the entire BFS every time the mouse changes cells. You can run the part of the BFS that explores the whole graph and constructs the predecessor array only once. And then, as you move the mouse cursor between cells, what you're going to trigger is just a recalculation of the optimal path backwards in the predecessor array from the current mouse location, or the current grid cell where the mouse is, back to the start, and an update of the visuals in the grid. You don't need to rerun the exploration of the entire graph and the computation of the predecessor array over and over again. Okay, so this next problem I want to talk about, this is going to be a little bit funny. I actually have a recording from 2 years ago when COVID first started, where I covered this material in my edition of CS341 then. So I'm actually just going to play, few minutes of video from that where I describe it then. So we're going to get, a blast from the past, Trevor, from a couple years ago. And, well, I'll join you again after that. Okay, so here's his root beer problem. This is a very Canadian, or I guess also in the US, we have root beer, right? Nice little play on words. So the root beer problem, we have this canyon with perpendicular walls on either sides of a forest. So imagine that these horizontal walls here are like a sheer rock face that you can't climb up or get through in any way. On either side, perfectly straight lines, just because, we have to simplify our problem slightly. And then there are a bunch of trees that you can't pass through, they block you, and the trees are represented by points. So don't think of the trees as circles with any diameter, they're actually just, we're modeling them as infinitesimally small points, okay? So infinitely small points in the 2D plane. And there's this bear that wants to travel through the canyon, and we're to assume that the bear actually has a diameter. So it's given a circle of diameter d. D is an input. The locations of the trees in xy coordinates are inputs, and you can assume that the bottom wall happens at y equals 0, and the top wall happens at y equals some constant that's specified in the input. And the goal is to find an algorithm that figures out, can the bear get through the forest? Because maybe the trees are so dense or so poorly arranged that the bear can't get through the forest, or maybe there is actually a path through the forest. Okay, so let's model this as a graph problem. And the first sort of step in figuring out what you should do to model a problem as a graph problem is ask yourself, what's a sort of reasonable way to express objects in the problem as nodes and as edges, and then you can start to ask, how can I harness existing graph problems to solve my real problem on this graph? And this is an iterative process. You usually don't get this right the first time. You might have to try a few different representations where you say, I'm going to let this be nodes, or I'm going to let this be nodes, and my edges are going to be defined in this weird way or in this completely different way. So you might have to try a few different expressions, and then finally, with enough creativity, you come up with an interesting expression of the problem that captures all the constraints and allows you to solve it efficiently by harnessing a graph problem. In this case, we're going to let the trees be nodes, and the bear will just be this sort of entity that's not actually in the graph. We just sort of conceptually think of it existing. And we're going to let all of the input nodes be vertices, all the input trees be vertices, and we're going to conceptually think of there being these lines at y equals 0 and y equals h, and we're actually going to add a bunch of nodes at various places on these two lines. So in particular, for every input point, xy, for every input tree at xy, we're going to add the following vertices. Okay, we're going to add xy, the point itself, but then we're also going to add x comma 0 and y comma, x comma h, where h is the height of the upper wall. So by the way, we're sort of viewing this from top down, right? So we're looking at the bear from the top. These trees are sticking straight up towards the camera, if you will, right? And these walls, just so you understand the layout, the bear's trying to go from left to right. Okay, so these are the nodes that we're going to add. For every input tree, we're going to add the vertices x0, xh, and xy. So you can see I've added all these here. And now what are our edges going to be? Our edges are actually going to represent the idea that the bear cannot pass between a particular pair of nodes. So there are different ways you could solve this problem. I'll show you one potentially inefficient way of doing it. I don't think it's important that we go into a super efficient algorithm. The important thing here is how we transform something that's not obviously a graph problem into something that is a graph problem. So what we're going to do is, for all pairs of vertices, all n squared pairs, well actually now we have, if there were n trees in the input, we have 3n vertices, right? So it's like 3n all squared, like 9n squared pairs of these vertices. We're going to check for each of these pairs of vertices u and v, is the distance too small for the bear to get between these 2 points? And if so, we're going to add an edge to the graph, okay? So look, between these 2 points here, this is too small for the bear to pass through, so we'll add an edge here, okay? And this is true for this, and this pair, and this pair, and this pair. And notice we're treating all of the vertices that are on the walls just the same way as all the rest of these sort of original vertices that were in the input. So we're representing sort of collisions between, where a bear couldn't get between a tree and the wall by an edge from a node in the middle to a node on the wall, right? And we're representing impassability between two trees as an edge where neither of the two endpoints are part of the wall, right? So we do this for all the pairs, and finally we've added all of the vertices, we've added all of the edges to all pairs of nodes between which the bear cannot pass. Okay, so at this point, the only way the bear can pass through this canyon is if the top and the bottom are disconnected. Because if the top and the bottom are connected by a path, then that means there's actually this sort of wall where for every pair of consecutive nodes on this path, the bear can't get between those two nodes. So we can see here the bear cannot get through in this case because the top and bottom are connected. So once we've made this graph formulation, we can actually just test if the top and bottom are connected. And, well, how would you do that? I'll give you sort of, if you want to pause and think about that, then maybe take a moment to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to assume now that you've thought about that if you wanted to. And the solution is just do a BFS or a DFS, any of these algorithms that tests connectivity. And all you have to do is, run a BFS from any point on the north wall, I don't know, the first one, and just check if any point is not on the south wall is not reachable, is black. Sorry, is white still. I think I said I flipped the colors here in my head. That's right. If a BFS starts, nodes start white, they change gray, then they change black. If the top and bottom are connected, then if I run a BFS starting anywhere on the top, all of the nodes in the top and all of the nodes in the bottom should end up black at the end. So if that's not true, if some node in the bottom is white at the end of our BFS, then we know that the bear can get through. And if all the nodes in the bottom are black, then we know that the bear can't get through.
Well, welcome back. The next thing I want to talk about is applications of minimum spanning trees. So the first application I want to talk about is image segmentation, and this is an algorithm that was covered in this paper that I have linked here, so if you're curious you can check out the original paper. And I kind of like this application because ostensibly it's a machine learning application, but this is actually an algorithmic approach to a problem that is usually solved with machine learning. And of course, this can be useful as a pre-processing step for machine learning algorithms, as we'll see in a moment. And this is sort of nice because machine learning seems to be pretty versatile, but there isn't a lot of, at least unless you are very careful with your machine learning theory, there isn't a lot that you get from machine learning in terms of guarantees or sort of transparency into what the algorithm's working and what the algorithm's doing and how it works. And so it's sort of nice to have algorithmic approaches to solve some of these problems because we can prove things about them. And we know exactly what they're doing to solve the problems. And it's also kind of neat because you can code this up yourself without having to have extremely sophisticated machine learning libraries and very powerful hardware. So what's image segmentation? The goal is to take some source image on the left. This is a figure taken from the paper, as these will all be on this slide. And we're going to try to, in the end, produce this image on the right, which is going to be basically some sort of low resolution, relatively low bit complexity encoding of the same image that's suitable to be fed into, for example, a neural net for recognition. So the rough idea here is we want to take the source image and then we want to break it up into regions by color similarity. And other algorithmic techniques that I won't talk about here are used for that. They're not particularly sophisticated, just the idea is I want to, you can imagine picking a pixel in this image and then sort of expanding that pixel as long as you don't run into highly dissimilar pixel colors. So you're going to produce all of these regions here on the right where you've basically grown your pixels in a grid into small regions. And then if you look at each of these regions, you could imagine putting a point in the center of each of these regions, and that point would be a node in a graph. And then each region, of course, has some neighboring regions. And so you would draw edges between the vertices at the center of each region and the vertices of neighboring regions, regions that touch each other. You're going to draw edges between those. And that's how you turn this bunch of regions into this graph here. And then you can connect all of the nodes in this graph by running an MST algorithm. So if you run a minimum spanning tree algorithm, what you're going to be doing is connecting all of this into one big connected component, and you're going to be picking the edges specifically that minimize the dissimilarity between these regions. Well, how does that work? Well, these regions, they're going to have weights. The edges between these regions are going to have weights that are related to the dissimilarity in color between the regions. So if I have an edge between two neighboring regions and their colors are quite different, it'll be a very expensive edge, a heavy edge. And if I have an edge between two regions that have very similar colors, it'll be a very light edge. So our MST algorithm is going to favor picking edges that have light weights, that have very similar colors. So in some sense, this MST is going to connect all of the regions in the way that minimizes the dissimilarity in their colors. And if you think about what heavy edges in this minimum spanning tree represent, those heavy edges represent crossings between dissimilar colors. So what we can then do is break this minimum spanning tree into large, highly similar segments, and we're going to try to break edges that represent very dissimilar crossings between very dissimilar regions. So you can imagine we could, if we wanted to break this into 10 regions, we could find the most expensive edge and break it. That would break it into 2 regions. Then we could find the next most expensive edge, and we could break, another pair of regions, right? Every edge that we remove is going to break one connected component into 2. So if we remove 9 edges, we're going to produce 10 regions. And if we always remove the 9 heaviest edges, right? If we're always removing the heaviest edge, we're breaking regions up that are as dissimilar as possible, right? So once you have your set of regions that you've broken this into, you can color them all according to the dominant color within each region. For example, you could average the colors in the region, or you could do something like finding the mode or the median color or something like that. And really the tricky part here is in deciding how many regions there should be, because it's relatively straightforward to find expensive edges in the MST and remove them. The big question, of course, where you need to tune things, and machine learning is always fraught with tuning problems, tunable parameters, is to decide how many edges you should remove, and thus how many segments you should produce. Okay, so anyway, that's a quick overview of that problem. I want to show you another problem called curvilinear feature extraction, which is, of course, quite related. This is about extracting features for feeding into machine learning algorithms. So suppose you want a machine learning algorithm to be able to recognize this object on the left. It's, of course, a house. It's maybe the back of a house. So we want to be able to recognize this object, and you can't simply feed this image into a machine learning algorithm because the image is huge. This image is about 84,000 pixels. That's way too big to feed into a neural net. You want, the number of inputs to a neural net to be, sort of like in the tens or hundreds of features, not tens of thousands of features. And so what we can do here is we can run a simple edge detection algorithm. So I'm not covering the edge detection algorithm. This is not a particularly sophisticated algorithm. What's being shown here is an edge detection algorithm called the Sobel algorithm. And it basically creates a dot everywhere there's a strong difference between the colors on either side of that dot. Roughly speaking. That's a little bit of a white lie, but it's pretty close. Now, if we take all of these dots and we connect them somehow to extract a curvilinear feature. What's a curvilinear feature? It's a bunch of lines with kinks in it, right? So we want to sort of extract like a line drawing of this image as sort of a low information density, sort of compressed, version of this image that's going to represent the shapes of the image in a way that'll allow the objects in the image to be identified without carrying around all of the extremely heavyweight pixel data. We're going to extract a curvilinear feature, or maybe multiple curvilinear features that try to capture the essence of this object. Okay, so we can, and it's going to be based off of the edges, the color edges in the image that we get from edge detection. So given all of these points that come out of edge detection, we can connect them all using an MST algorithm. Now we get something that actually looks sort of like the shape of the house. But of course, this involves far less data that needs to be communicated to a machine learning algorithm than communicating all of the raw points, than communicating all of the raw pixels. And it conveys more information than the raw points because this indicates how the points are connected. Now, this is quite a hairy image, right? It's not a very clean line. And so in the paper that I'm going to show a link to here, which you can go look at this paper if you're curious, they came up with their own ad hoc algorithm for what they called hair removal, where if they have a long linear a long line segment, and then they have these little hairs sticking off that have length 1 or 2 nodes, they remove those. But 3 nodes or more, that was their arbitrary cutoff to say that's not a hair, that's an important feature. So they remove, some of these extraneous hairs, and they end up with a slightly cleaner looking MST image there. And then that, for example, can get fed to a machine learning algorithm. So the final result, just to see how closely this matches the original, you can overlay it on the original image and see. And I thought this was kind of a cute use case for MST, basically kind of like an intelligent compression algorithm for images to be fed to a machine learning algorithm. There's the paper link. Curvilinear feature extraction can be used for other things as well besides machine learning. This is actually a simple enough algorithm that I thought it might be fun to implement it. So I actually sat down and implemented this in Python. And, as I do in this course, I made a video showing a time lapse of me implementing it. And yeah, take a look at that. And then if you're curious, and then after that, you can always skip it if you're not interested. We'll look at the results of running that on some images. All right, so let's see what comes out of this program when we plug in the original image that these guys used in their paper. So here we have the familiar house image on the top left. Let me just switch to my laser pointer here. I applied I said 3 pixels here, but I think this is actually a 2 pixel Gaussian blur. We did the Sobel edge detection. I converted the Sobel edge detection to grayscale. In this case, this is a grayscale image, so it doesn't make a difference. And then the next step I did was I implemented some simple hard thresholding. So basically, I dropped the 80% weakest detected edge points just to reduce the amount of data I was working with. So basically, I only kept edge detection gives brighter pixels if there is a harder edge. So I just kept the top 20% brightest pixels, and I showed it in false color here just to make it easier to see. And then again, to cut down on the amount of data, because this is still many pixels, like thousands of pixels that are edge detected. I took a random sample of those pixels. So I just took 1,000 from those pixels that I didn't drop with hard thresholding. And then I constructed an MST from that. So 1,000 vertices means 999 edges in the minimum spanning tree. And I checked the result, and it actually looks quite a bit like what these guys came up with in the paper. And since I have the code, why not run it on some other images? So I went hunting for stock images. So here's a nice stock image, again shown in false color. So I applied a Gaussian blur, did my edge detection, cast the edge detection to grayscale, but then it's shown in false color here anyway. So I suppose I didn't have a very good visualization of the edge detection and the grayscale edge detection. Oops. Then I sampled oh, sorry, actually, this is not the grayscale edge detection. I decided it wasn't a very good visualization after the previous slide, so I ended up cutting it out, and this is the hard thresholding. So here you can see there's some extra detail in this image that's not in this image, so I basically got rid of the detected edges that weren't very strong to reduce noise. And also to reduce the amount of data. So and that was true on the previous slide as well. One of the reasons to reduce the bottom 80% of detected, edge pixels is including them creates a huge amount of noise in the image that you don't necessarily need. We really just want to consider the brightest edges. Because hopefully they'll. When I say brightest, I don't mean brightest in the image color space. I mean they define the strongest edges, the strongest color differences between one object and one pixel and a nearby pixel. So that hopefully those strongest edges will define the objects more readily. And then of course I sample. In this case, I sampled 3,000 points from the hard thresholded edge detected data. This sampling is very simple, by the way. This is just like one line of code in Python. So I used libraries for this, but so is the Gaussian blur and the Sobel edge detection. The hard thresholding was a handful of lines, and the sampling was a couple lines, including one to do the actual randomization. And then I run my MST algorithm. This I implemented from scratch in Python, so this ended up taking probably the most code out of all this, other than some boilerplate image processing code. And then I overlaid that in the image so you can see the result. And okay, it's a pretty hairy MST algorithm because I didn't implement their hair removal algorithm, but nevertheless, this is some sort of compressed version of this image that retains some of the shape information. And really what we've done here is we've compressed 480,000 pixels into 2,999 edges because I sampled 3,000 points. So that's some pretty serious compression. Here's running it on a picture of dice. So blur, edge detection, hard thresholding, sampling, point sampling, and MST construction, and then overlay. Okay. And here's just a test image that's been known to foil lots of object detection algorithms. So I thought it'd be sort of curious to run on this sort of hard image I found in a paper. So Gaussian blur, edge detection, hard thresholding, sampling, MST, overlay. So it doesn't, I mean, obviously we aren't separating these into images, and of course the sampling ends up sort of blowing up the widths of these squares a little bit because we sample, after the hard thresholding, we sample, our samples are equally likely to come from the boldest lines or sort of the fainter edges of the boldest lines. I didn't use a very sophisticated sampling strategy, so it's not weighted sampling, it's unweighted sampling from the hard thresholded data. So I could have done a smarter algorithm here. Anyway, there's running that algorithm. The next thing I want to talk about, quite related, is this problem of k-clustering. So suppose you want to cluster data into groups. So suppose we have some data it's two-dimensional data, and we can draw our axes. Here's an x-axis from negative 0.5 to 0.5, and a y-axis from negative 0.5 to 0.5. And suppose we have data points that appear, distributed across these two axes. And we think probably data is clustered on these two axes. As a human, if you look at the data, you see, yeah, it does look like the data is kind of clustered. And we'd like to have an algorithm to determine how to cluster this data. And in this case, we're going to hypothesize that there are three clusters and ask the program to identify for us what is the data in those three clusters, which data points fall into those clusters, and perhaps are there some outliers that we can remove altogether. So it turns out you can do this with minimum spanning trees as well, because if you want to cluster this data into three groups, all you have to do is build a minimum spanning tree, and of course you have to define edge weights somehow, so why don't we define edge weights according to their distance in this 2D space defined by these two axes. Of course you could define it any way that you like, that makes sense. You want a reasonable metric to cluster your data. you should have some metric that you understand when you're talking about clustering, because the way that you cluster is going to depend entirely on how you measure the distance between points, right? So supposing you have such a measure, you're going to give each edge a weight, right? You're going to say for all pairs of points that I have, I'm going to imagine that there's an edge with a weight that I know how to define, and I'm going to build a minimum spanning tree out of all of my data. And so out of all the possible edges, I'm going to select the edges that minimize the total distance to connect everything according to my metric for clustering. So we end up with something that looks like this picture on the left. So we have a minimum spanning tree. Now, if we want to cluster it into 3 groups, we can simply delete the 3 most costly edges. Or I think I've made a typo here. We delete the 2 most costly edges, because when I delete 1, I've created 2 groups. When I delete 2, I've created 3 groups. So sorry, we have to delete the 2 most costly edges to produce 3 groups. Okay, so that will separate these things into 3 groups. But some of these things are quite far. Some of these data points are quite far away from clusters, and so maybe you want to additionally do some. If you're really trying to solve k-clustering, you might also want to think a little bit about outlier detection and whether there are some points that don't reasonably fall into any of these clusters. So by breaking 2 edges, you're going to end up with 3 clusters that contain all of the points. So you may additionally then want to consider which of my points are outliers and remove those, so I'm left with something clean like this on the right that shows, here are the things that sort of rightly belong into these, in these groups. And you might do that, for example, by considering for all of the entries after breaking the 2 edges, the 2 heaviest edges, consider for all of the data points that are in each cluster, find the mean and the standard deviation of the distances between all pairs of data points, for example. And then if there are any data points that are more than, X number of standard deviations from the mean away from the center of the cluster, you could rule those out, for example. Okay, so we can run this algorithm for breaking things up into components, clustering our points, in the same context as we ran our curvilinear feature extraction. So what if we run curvilinear feature extraction to get our MST, and then we try to break our MST into components? In some sense, that's the same thing as doing k-cluster analysis on the data points that the curvilinear feature consists of, right? So we're going to try to group the data points of the curvilinear feature into clusters. So we're going to try to, have it extract, this is a window, and this is a roof, and this is a door, and so on. And so, for example, if we take this MST that we got from curvilinear feature extraction, we delete the heaviest edge, we're going to be left with 2 components. Right, that's what ends up happening here in this example. We have 2 components. So whatever this is far off in the top left of the sky, it gets separated from the house. If we remove 4 edges, we get 5 components. And so it just so happens in this case, we end up separating the house from whatever that is in the sky, and the perimeter of the house from these 2 windows. And we don't end up separating, I think this is a door, from anything else. And we do end up separating, I think, what's probably the garage door down here from the rest of the house. Okay, now we can also run this on a different kind of image. So here, this is like a picture of some vine with a squirrel sitting on it in a forest with some light poking through, shrubbery in the background. Gaussian blur, edge detection, hard thresholding, sampling, MST, overlay on the image, and I removed some number of edges here. So here I removed 3 edges, and I ended up breaking off, this background here, the light shining through the leaves here. I separated that from, everything else, and I separated this little light hole in the canopy here from everything else. But, this is kind of arbitrary, right? I removed 3 edges. Why 3? How do we know how many edges to delete? How do we segment things into objects? And really, this just comes down to the fact that machine learning is fraught with tuning problems, right? So, just for my own curiosity, because, I like to chase down these problems and just try to see what I can solve on my own, I just tried a couple of approaches. What if I delete the 1%, the top 1% bad edges, the heaviest 1% of edges? Well, it does separate things into some reasonable objects, as you can see here on the right. But it also creates lots of unnecessary components, right? Because if I remove the worst 1% of edges, I'm always going to make, some number of components. I'm going to make a worst 1% of components, right? So here's a better idea. What if we identify outliers using standard deviations, right? Of course, this is assuming something about the distribution of our data, which we don't necessarily really know. But, well, anyway, let's try it and see what happens. So suppose that I identify outliers using the standard deviation of weights. So I look at the mean and standard deviation of edge weights, and then I delete edges arbitrarily that are higher than they are heavier in terms of weight than 4 times the standard deviation away from the mean. So these are extremely heavy edges. These are the ones that end up being detected, and here's the house that gets separated. And you can see I have far fewer spurious components because we're really only removing things that are extraordinarily far from the mean, and the number of things you remove varies. If you have very few things that are very, very far away from the mean, then we'll remove very few things. And if you compare with the top worst 1% edges being deleted, it does seem like this does a better job. Okay, anyway, this is heuristic. This is not something I can really prove anything about, but I can show it on another image. Here's the squirrel on a branch image, and here's how it ends up dividing up components. And I can overlay the divided components over the image, and yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how these things get divided. And the 4x here, of course, the 4x standard deviation threshold for breaking up components is, of course, a tunable parameter. And here's running the same thing on this strange image here, which I guess is dice seen from the top down with an extra circle. Very strange dice. And you can see it actually ends up separating a number of reasonable objects, although partially because of our poor sampling strategy, it doesn't end up separating any of these dice from each other. And, here's the 3D dice, and it's funny, when I ran this the first time, I was like, what the heck is this red stuff off to the bottom right? What is this being separated? And then I went back and looked at this image and realized there was an image of this die, or no, sorry, this one, reflected vertically on the ground that I never saw in the first place. So, kind of funny. And if we compare deleting the worst 1%, we can see there are a bunch of arbitrary selections that are unlinked here. The bunch of arbitrary edge removals, some of which are preserved in the standard deviation-based approach. But it seems like the standard deviation-based approach makes fewer of these strange, undesirable edge removals. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is really just one application of topological sort. So this application is called task scheduling. Suppose you have a bunch of tasks that you need to complete, and they have dependencies. So for example, in this diagram, we have 19 tasks that need to be completed, and they have dependencies. So one needs to be done before 3, and one also needs to be done before 13. And 2 needs to be done before 3, 3 needs to be done before 4, and 3 also needs to be done before 5, and so on. Looking the opposite direction, before I can do 7, I need to do 4, 5, and before 4 and 5, I need to do 3, and before 3, I need to do 2 and 1. And so the problem here is to find a schedule that allows you to complete all of these tasks in serial order. So we'd like a single order that I can do these tasks in one at a time so that all of the constraints of this problem are respected. Okay, now this diagram is actually labeled according to one such order: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. If you do them in that order, all of the constraints are satisfied whenever you do a particular task. Okay, so the goal is to output a serial order of tasks that can be run without worrying about the dependencies, because all of the dependencies are already going to be satisfied by the time a task is run. Now, so here, we've labeled the nodes according to one such order. And now, something that's kind of interesting about task scheduling, you can solve this in a really straightforward way with topological sort, right? So all you really have to do is take this task scheduling problem, represent it as a graph, so the tasks become nodes and the dependencies become edges. In particular, if I need to do node 1 before node 3, there's an edge from 1 to 3, and then I run topological sort on this graph. And topological sort is going to output an ordering that I can do these tasks in such that the dependencies are all going to be satisfied, unless it happens to be impossible to perform such a task, to perform these tasks in an order that respects all dependencies. If I can't respect all dependencies, that means there's a cycle in the graph, and my topological sort will fail. Okay, so that's like a really straightforward application of topological sort, but you can actually schedule these tasks to run in parallel if we do a topological sort intelligently, and if it just so happens that for our particular problems, our particular tasks, there are no extra dependencies between them apart from the dependencies expressed in the dependency graph that we're doing task scheduling on. If apart from the task dependencies that we have in the graph, all of the tasks are truly independent, then for example, we can do 1 and 2 in parallel. And then once we've done 1 and 2, all of these pointers going out from 1 and 2, all these edges going out from 1 and 2, we can imagine are removed from the graph. And now there are some other nodes within degree 0 with no incoming dependencies, 3 and 13, and we can do those in parallel. And then once those are done, we can remove the outgoing edges from them. So 3 will no longer point to 5 or 4, and 13 will no longer point to 15. So then we can do 4 and 5 and 15 in parallel. So if you're actually trying to solve task scheduling, then it's possible to do a topological sort that will help you organize these tasks so that they can be done in parallel batches, hopefully doing all of this in less time in total. So how would you do such a topological sort? Well, there's one topological algorithm that I believe is covered in the Erickson book. I haven't checked whether Anna covered this version of topological sort in class, but either way, I can describe it briefly to you now. All you do in this topological sort algorithm is for every node, you count how many edges are pointing into it. This is the integree of a node. So we pre-compute at the beginning of the computation the integree of every node. So 1 would be 0, 2 would be 0, 3 would be 2, 4 would be 1, 5 would be 1, 6 would be 1, 12 here would be 3, right? It's the number of edges coming in. So we compute that, and we'll store that in an array where we're mapping the node ID to the integree of the node with that ID. So integree of 1 would be 0, right? And so on. Now what you do in this algorithm, if you want to come up with a topological sort and you want to feed batches of nodes, batches of tasks to some framework that can run those tasks in parallel, is first you iterate over the integree array and you find all of the nodes with integree 0 and you execute all of those tasks in parallel. So that'll be 1 and 2 in the first iteration. And then you remove all of those nodes once they're either the tasks have been run or even at the same time as the tasks have been run. So you can imagine you collect all the nodes with integree 0, start their tasks, and while those tasks are running in parallel, you remove those 2 nodes and prepare the next batch of parallel tasks to run. When you remove those nodes, you also remove the outgoing edges conceptually. And what this means is we need to update the integree array by basically iterating over all of the outgoing edges from the nodes that we just scheduled so that their tasks will run in parallel. We go over all those edges, and for each such edge, we decrement the integree of the target of that edge, right? So for the edge from 1 to 13, we decrement integree 13. Once we've done that, we search for all of the nodes that have integree 0 in the integree array. We schedule all of those tasks to run in parallel, and then we look at all of their outgoing pointers and decrement the integrees of all of the nodes that they point to. Okay. So we just repeat that over and over. And if there's ever a step where we can't find any node with integree 0, that means there's a cycle, and actually we can't do this. So if you want to make sure that that's not going to happen to you partway through running the tasks in parallel, you could do the whole calculation initially to compute, to make sure that you don't ever run into a scenario where you have no nodes with integree 0, where there's a cycle in the graph. And then once you've done that topological sort the first time and seen that it worked out, then you can do this topological sort where you extract the batches of tasks and run them in parallel. Okay, so that's kind of a short run through of parallel task scheduling. Now the last thing I want to talk about is applications of strongly connected components. So we saw an algorithm in class for strongly connected components. And if you remember, a strongly connected component is a component of a graph such that every node is reachable from every other node in that component. Every node in the component is reachable from every other node in that component by following 0 or more edges. So one really interesting use case, super practical use case of strongly connected components and also of component graphs is to serve as a data filtering stage before running other algorithms. So suppose that you're Google and you want to implement pathfinding in Google Maps. So in this case, nodes would be intersections, for example, and edges would be roads that travel between them. And whenever someone wants you to do pathfinding, from home to the corner store, you don't want to run your pathfinding algorithm like Dijkstra's or Bellman-Ford on the entire global graph. You want to run it on a small local graph because it's extremely unlikely that in order to drive to the 7-Eleven down the street, I need to hop on a boat and go to Europe and then, travel to Russia and cross the land bridge, that they're building to Alaska and so on, right? So I really want to be able to run on a local graph because I'm going to end up with the same answer, and I'm going to be able to greatly speed up my computation because instead of I don't know, hundreds of millions of intersections, I can look at like a couple thousand intersections maybe, if that. So here's the idea. You are going to take the whole map and you're going to crop it somehow and then find the largest strongly connected component that contains the start and end. The source that you're trying to travel from and the destination you're trying to travel to. So first you're going to restrict your execution to a rectangle that's big enough that it contains both the source and destination. And of course you're going to want to make it a little bit bigger than the source and destination because maybe you have to take a circuitous route from the source to the destination. And if that travels outside the rectangle, you'll lose the ability to pathfind appropriately. So you throw away everything that's outside that rectangle. All the nodes and edges outside that rectangle you throw out. And then you find a strongly connected component in that rectangle that contains the source and target nodes. If you can't find a strongly connected component in that rectangle that contains the source and target nodes, you need to grow the rectangle until you can find one. And once you do have a strongly connected component containing the source and target, you know that you'll be able to pathfind from the source to the target. And as long as your rectangle isn't so small that you've ruled out the optimal path between those two locations, if your rectangle is big enough that the optimal path is contained within it, so you want to add some nice padding, then you'll get the same answer as if you'd run your computation on the enormous, 100 million node graph. Okay, so another application of SECs is to understand the behavior of social dynamics and groups in social network graphs. So, it's debatable whether we want to support entities like Facebook, for example, in studying our behavior and exploiting us for, improved ad revenue or whatever other nefarious aims they have, social engineering. Nevertheless, it is a popular use case for strongly connected components because if you find strongly connected components in a social network graph, it ends up telling you something about communities that have formed in that social network. And so, social networks like to study the evolution of those communities and, usually do things like exploit them for ad revenue. Okay, so another application is finding all of the cyclic dependencies in code. So if you've ever used Excel and written formulae that refer to one another, they'll complain that there's a cyclic dependency. Similarly, if you have cyclic dependencies in your code, like compilation dependencies that can't be resolved, you'd like your IDE to be able to tell you that that's the case. And you don't really want errors of the form, hey, you have a cyclic dependency, or maybe you have 1,000, I don't know, you've got at least one, here's one. That's not very convenient to debug. If you only have one of these that's handed to you, you fix it, and then it says, well, wait, you still have another cyclic dependency, and you have no idea how many of them you're going to have to fix, or maybe you should just give up on this code base and scrap it and start over. So you'd really like the IDE to tell you, these are all of the cyclic dependencies that you have. And so you can find a single cycle in a dependency graph with a DFS-based algorithm, or topological sort for that matter, but it's nicer to find all of the cycles at once. And so you can use strongly connected components to expose those because the components in the component graph are, in fact, those components that contain cycles. Another application, I think this might be the last application that I'm mentioning, I just think this one's really cool. So studying connectome graphs. What's a connectome? Well, these are graphs that are used for modeling nervous systems of biological entities. So for example, the brain and the nervous system, the central nervous system of a human. So in such graphs, vertices usually correspond to cells in the body and edges correspond to the contacts between cells that facilitate, for example, communication or interaction with other entities in the body. And strongly connected components seem to have a really important role in brain connectome graphs. So for example, a 2016 paper found that a fly brain connectome had one large, strongly connected component with 785 nodes, where the nodes here are neurons in the brain. And the rest of the brain, then there's a fair bit of brain to work with outside of that large, strongly connected component. But the rest of the brain consisted of tiny components of 1 to 2 nodes. You have one massive, extremely well connected, strongly connected region in the brain consisting of 785 neurons, and then you have tons of other nodes in the brain that are extremely weakly connected. And so this kind of informs our study of the brain, right? The existence of such structures motivates the study of such structures, and SEC algorithms that are efficient run in, and they have to be efficient to run in increasingly large brains that we're studying. A fly brain is not very big, but we've actually found similar structures in rat and cat brains, and our connectome graphs are only going to complexify dramatically as as we study more and more sophisticated brains. We're going to need better and better algorithms for being able to reason about important parts of the brain, since it'll be intractable to run algorithms that are sophisticated graph algorithms, probably on the complete connectome graphs. And there's some really fascinating research on this by a professor who used to be in my research area, now has switched over in part to do this kind of work at MIT, named Nir Shavit. So if you're interested in seeing other stuff about connectome graphs, that's an interesting avenue to run down. So the very last thing that I'm going to mention in this lecture, Freudian slip in this tutorial, is visualizing graph algorithms is something that you should all do. When you learn these graph algorithms, seeing them described on paper in the lecture, sure, it's helpful. We wouldn't be teaching them that way if we didn't think it would be helpful, but there are a lot of tools that you can use to visualize graph algorithms now. And I think you're a fool as a student if you don't avail yourself of these opportunities and try to, visualize these things and get a really solid sense for how these algorithms behave. And so there's this lovely website that I'm going to show you now. Very briefly, and you can of course explore this on your own, where there are visualizations for all sorts of really cool algorithms, and not just graph algorithms, tons of data structure algorithms, etc. But for graph algorithms, look, there are visualizations for breadth first search, depth first search, connected components, Dijkstra's prims, topological sort, Floyd-Warshall, Kruskal. Like, this is a lot of the stuff that's covered in the course, right? So I encourage you, for each of the algorithms that you study in class, go to this website and check out some visualizations and try to make sure that you understand how the algorithm behaves. So for example, for depth first search, sorry, I have my dark color scheme on here. Let me remove the dark color scheme. You can generate random graphs, directed or undirected, large or small, and you can look at different representations of the adjacency, of the graph, adjacency list or matrix, which I think can help you understand adjacency list and matrix representations of the graph as well, and understand the differences in how those different representations cause the DFS algorithm to behave, right? It'll go through a different sequence of steps with a different complexity. So you have all these lovely parameters that you can tweak, and you can pick a starting vertex and you can run. So let's see a DFS starting at vertex 3. I can run this. I can step through the algorithm quickly or slowly, one step at a time, or I can just have it play a nice animation for me. So I encourage you to take a look at this, and it's not a bad idea to run examples where you predict the behavior of the algorithm, and if it does something that you didn't expect, you can always correct your understanding of it. But I love that sort of predictive learning or generative learning where you're trying to say, almost like you're teaching yourself, this is what's going to happen, and it does something special to the human brain, I think, where when your expectation is defied, you learn better. When you'd formed an expectation, your expectation is defied than if you'd sort of passively tried to absorb the information. Okay, so I'll leave this at that, and I'll close with a break video. Normally I put these videos in as breaks and I do a time lapse at the end. This time I did, of course, the coding time lapse in the middle. So I'll do a, as some students have called them, carpentry break at the end. Okay, see you guys.